So first of all, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the organizers. I'm very honored to chair this panel of practices of embodiment. I will come and go. That is, I will introduce the speakers one by one. The first paper is 20 years performing for the camera, self-portraiture or otherness. Ana Janeiro uses self-portraiture and performance photography in her artistic research. She holds a PhD from the University of Westminster and a master's in photography from the KIAD, currently UCA in the UK. She studied fine arts at the University of Lisbon. She's an invited associate professor at the School of Communication and Media Studies of the Lisbon Polytechnic, and she teaches photography, the Photography and Visual Culture course at IADE, IAD for the Portuguese folks. She is represented in several art collections and has exhibited regularly since the year's mid-2000s. The following solo shows are of special note. The archive is present at the London Gallery West in the UK in 2019, album India Portuguesa 1951-1961 at Laboratório das Artes in Guimarães 2010. She recently participated in the following group shows: BF20, Biennial of Photography, Vila Franca de Xira, 2021, Trabalho Capital, Greve Geral at Centro de Arte Oliva in São João da Madeira, 2019, Goa Photo, revisiting the album Aldona Goa, India, 2019, IPHON, an exhibition between art and research, Ambika P3, London, in 2019. Do Outro Lado do Espelho at Museum Calouste Gulbenkian, Lisboa, 2017-18, Between Here and Then, London Gallery West, CREAM, University of Westminster, in 2017. Betwixt and Between at FOMU Photo Museum of Antwerp, Belgium, 2017. Big list. So you have the floor. I'm going to disappear. Have fun.
Hello. Okay, can everyone hear me well like this? Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. It's been fantastic so far, and I'm hoping it will continue to be today and tomorrow. So today I'm going to talk a bit about the last 20 years of work I've been doing. And it's actually, I'm slightly nervous because I'm actually going to show you some work which I've never shown publicly before, and I'm a bit nervous about it. So I will appreciate any feedback that you will have to tell me afterwards or during the next couple of days. So I've been working in performance using myself, performing for the camera. And parallel to that, I've also always done self-portraits, which I've never shown because they were quite intimate. So that's a bit what I'll be showing today. I'm investigating the relationship between performance photography and self-portraiture. Performing or acting for the purpose of the photographic record isn't the foundation of photography itself. Self-portraiture has established itself as a genre which women have used to represent themselves and to question identities, men as well, obviously. But I'm focused more my research and my work on understanding how women use their own bodies in searching or trying to represent identity. Quoting Peggy Fellon, women artists have used the self-portraiture to investigate the foundational otherness of women within contemporary Western representation. And I suppose I have tried to focus my work on that as well. So today, using my work as a case study, I will explore the interconnections between performance photography and self-portraiture. Quoting Emilia Jones now, considering that the self-portrait is eminently performative, this paper and the talk I'm giving today investigates the relationship between the performance aspects in the self-portraiture. I've always worked photographing myself, being the subject of my represented narratives. The framework for my photographic practice is self-portraiture, self-representation, performance photography. Lately, whilst I was on my PhD research, it became quite, it was a bit of a revelation. It became quite evident that there is a clear performance for the camera, and since my earliest work around 1998. And today it's my intention to show you some of the projects I have developed over the years. I'm going to focus on 5 of the ones I think are more relevant. So I'm going to describe a bit the work process, my intentions, but I also want to show a side of my photography, which I've never shown before, which is parallel to this practice, all the self-portraits that I have been taking. And these are intimate photographs, which at the time they were shot were not intended to be shown publicly. And the ones I've been showing now were just a selection of works since I produced since the early 2000s. So this work, which you can see here, 11, was based in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. So it is a broad and free interpretation of the book. It's not necessarily an illustration. And the idea of 2 realities where a character is confronted with herself, though in this project, the house itself acts as the mirror. And this was the first project in which a book or a specific subject was used as a starting point. It was technically challenging as well, because the project is entirely shot on film using the double exposure technique. So there isn't any digital manipulation to it at all. Afterwards, I began reading other tales, including those for children. And I was confronted with the multiplicity of versions which existed for each specific story, such as Little Red Riding Hood. And I began investigating different versions of the same stories from different times and from different cultures. And what really interested me was how the female figures, which in older versions usually had leading roles, had changed throughout history. What I later discovered and explored visually in this project, Who's the Fairest One of All, and each subtitle or each title of each image corresponds to a quote from each particular tale. And what I found was that, in fact, throughout history, the female roles had changed from being an independent protagonist to a naive and helpless one. So throughout history, that's sort of what happened to most of children's tales, where usually a male protagonist was the rescuer. I'm quite interested in photography's narrative capacity and the ability to tell stories through visual. And what I've mostly dedicated the past 20 years of my career to is exploring representations of women, and by questioning how these representations can be made. And I've been the subject throughout my work, performing for the camera as an actor in all these diverse stories. The work Álbum Índia Portuguesa, 1951-1961, marks a shift in my work, navigating from books and stories written by different authors. I began looking into archives and into the possibilities of the stories contained within them. I started looking at my own family's archive relative to the period in which my grandparents, on my mother's side, lived in what was then the Portuguese territories of India, in Goa and Daman. And exploring my family's photographic albums and transcripts of letters, and I reconstructed several episodes from this period. And from the many letters that my grandmother wrote to her mother over that 10-year period, I selected from her life, and that formed the basis for staging of my photographs. And these events were the ones I thought most relevant for my family's history. And it's actually, this story of dispersion was recurrent for many other Portuguese people during the dictatorship. And it's this intertwining between collective and personal history that has interested me, and which I have continued to explore and pursue in my work and research. And it's also where my own archive fever began. So the concerns explored through my work have always been related to identity, memory, not necessarily my own identity, but a construction of an identity, usually female identity. How can women represent themselves? Where are the references for this representations, the role models? I'm a woman, so in this sense, when I use my own image, my body as a character, I'm representing women, exploring characteristics such as body language, expression, and how these are representative of women. In this project, Miroir Fidèle, Faithful Mirror, I took a methodology for interpreting archives to create a site-specific project. And so I was invited to do a site-specific project in the Palácio do Marquês, which belonged to the Marquis de Pombal. And from the challenge to do this site-specific project, which was empty of furniture, historical artifacts, and without any visual records, photographic or otherwise, from the interior of the palace or its contents. And it was from this absence that I created a new archive with the purpose of describing the everyday life in that setting in the 1700s. The only existing images that describe the everyday life are the decorative tiles found throughout the whole palace and its gardens as well. And it's in these images that lays the only visual record of everyday life and leisure in the palace. So these tiles were the basis for this archive, which is more than a mere inventory. It's also a reinterpretation. The framing given by the photograph image breaks it away from the realm of painting into the realm of the photographic. And from these everyday life scenes, I selected the ones which better represent female roles at the time, privileging narratives and scenes which portray intimacy and leisure, and consciously excluding activities exclusive to men, such as hunting and fishing, which were also painted in many of the rooms in the palace. And it was actually in this context, the role of the Countess Dawn, which was the second wife to the Marquis de Pombal, who actually stood out for changing a lot the social life in the palace and including women in the social life, which at that time had not been done in Portugal, because she came from France, so it's very different. And in her chambers are the room of 5 senses, which contain the tiles that give title to the exhibition. Sight, 2 objects charm a young woman, a lover, a faithful mirror. And this work allowed me to explore creatively and without script It was a freer work process, and it also corresponded to a collaboration, which including photographing other people and including them also in the narrative. Personally, it was quite liberating to make, and it allowed myself a stronger protagonism for bodily expression, physicality. I'm a bit ambitious sometimes about the amount of images I want to show. So the work which I'm about to show next, which is the archive is present, was developed during my PhD research, and it corresponds to very thorough research and development of methods to analyze and interpret archives through performance and embodiment. And the work and research investigates family photographic archives from, well, my own grandparents' photographic archive, mother's and father's parents, and they represent also a period in Portugal's history from 1940 to 1975, which was the time frame that I selected, and which is also the same, catches a bit of the period of the fascist dictatorship, which was one of the longest in history, the new state. And the photographic work focuses specifically on an analysis of photographs in the family albums from both families, and the images of my two grandmothers as representative of two women's lives during this historical period. Both women lived under the same dictatorial regime, but one living in mainland Portugal and the other one in Portuguese overseas territories, in India between 1951 and 61, and then in Mozambique from 1962 to 1975. And each album demonstrates specific cultural differences and the specificity of different cultural images in their construction. And ultimately, with the end of the regime, these images are inherited in the identity of women in Portugal to this day, including my own. And the work that I developed is a performative method for interpreting and enacting what I actually discovered within the archives. So it's actually a very, I'm not going to go into that today. That would be a whole other conference, and has been before, about how I actually arrived at these conclusions within the research of the archive. But this work was very important. Here you can visually see a bit of the process. But this work marks a very important stage in my realization as an artist. A PhD obviously requires a very in-depth take on a subject, and in this case made me realize I have been performing for the camera since the earliest work I produced. And with this project, it was also the first time I made a live performance in front of an audience. So not simply performing for the camera in my own studio, private setting, but actually performing in front of others. And this was very important for me. Unfortunately, then came the pandemic, and I haven't been able to do that as often as I would like to, but I will return to it, I'm sure. Just to show you a few of those images. So this are a few images from the performance. So the first time I did it was in Ambica P3, and then this one is in a conference, reframing the archive in Porto. And it was very interesting to understand how much during live performance and how the connection to the audience is completely different that from showing a still image. So it was quite interesting and revealing for me. But I have since fully embraced the performative aspect of my work, whether it is towards the camera or a live audience. And this also led me to look back and work on my own photographic archive with a different perspective. So I've been selecting the self-portraits that I've made over the years, and I've photographed myself extensively in parallel to all the works that I've been showing you here today. But these images, unlike exploring specific themes, are intimate and autobiographical self-portraits. Yet posing and the act of performing is still visible in them. Quoting Roland Barthes, once I feel myself observed by the lens, everything changes. I constitute myself in the process of posing. I instantaneously make another body for myself. I transform myself in advance into an image. And I think this transforming oneself in advance into an image when confronted with the lens or the camera is one of the foundations of photographic self-portraiture, performance photography. Because when I turn myself into that image, even before it exists, I turn myself and become that image. And the image inhabits me and is transformed within and by me. And the image is created even before it is shot. And I decided to show these photographs because I realized they also signify attempts of representation of identity, stories, life. Although for me, they're intimate and private, they're also acts of performance. And also a demonstration of how my own practice contaminated, in a good way, the whole of my life. And so today, instead of leaving you with a series of my own conclusions, I would like to leave you with a series of questions, which I've been attempting to unveil myself. Is there a frontier to what we call self-portraiture and what we call performing for the camera? How does the photographer face the camera? Is it regarded as its future audience? How does the body convey self or other in the acts of performance? Is there a border between fiction and reality when it comes to self-portraiture? And if so, where is it set? Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Facebook will leave you again to share probably, and we have to try to to online. Vamos tentar a magia. We'll try to. No. 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 Okay, we will try later for the. No. Então. No. We'll try later.
In the meantime, thank you so much, Anna, for so many interesting questions. I'm sure they have generated a lot of thoughts. They have, to me. So let me present you Anna Dinger, who will talk about the body as archive and the archive as a body, specifically on the case of modus operandi. And Anna Dinger would rather not define what she does. She would rather suspend categories, if only for a sentence. From early on, she has engaged with theory and practice and its entanglements, and has often preferred multi, or transdisciplinary approaches to whatever subject matters cross her path. Her academic trajectory includes training in dance and the visual arts, with a graduation in sculpture by the Faculty of Fine Arts, first at Porto and then Lisbon universities. Art studies focused on contemporary art with a post-graduation at UCP, and cultural studies currently undergoing PhD at UCP. This is the Catholic University of Lisbon. She collaborates in manifold modes of participation and many degrees of intensity and extensivity with several projects that have an inclination towards artistic research and curation, namely EndLab, a timeline to be genealogies of dance as artistic practice in Portugal, and Ordinary Assembly. From her artistic work, she highlights the Matalogue series, started in collaboration with Fernanda Eugenio in 2015, which is a series of conversations that inhabit a different question at each edition and take such diverse forms as a lecture without speech, a game of cards, or a task-oriented performance in a garden. She writes about visual and performative arts, sentient and otherwise living archives, and modes of continuation of performance-based artworks. So you have the floor, my dear.
Thank you, Paula. So, hi everyone, and thank you to the organizing committee for this opportunity to actually share with you work that seems to be with me for a long time, and at the same, but simultaneously is just a new entry point. So what I have to share with you today are quite sparse notes, and but I hope that they will enable us to engage in further conversation. And Rebecca Schneider is not, it's not here in the room today, but actually this presentation is, it hails back, forward and sideways. So it's a multi-directional hail to her talk, a keynote talk, and her work on gesture. So this response call will be further deferred. So I will start by sharing with you a few anchors so that you can begin to imagine what modus operandi and entails, because it is quite rhizomatic, multiple, and I usually actually propose like an accretion of, or a multiplicity of definitions or of circumscriptions that have been given throughout the time, instead of single out one. But one of my favorites is actually uninhabited philosophy. So Fernando Eugenio speaks about philosophy with people in it. Fernando Eugenio obviously has been the generative force or at the heart of this project and this work. But of course, it's an unfinished construction with the help of many hands. And actually here you have a few markers of this. There's and serves to name the AND Lab, which is the platform that aggregates all the researchers and artists that relate to this work. And then there's Modus Operandi and there's also the end game, but we'll get there. So there are manifold ways of enunciating what modus operandi and may be. Some of them are an ongoing investigation of ways of living together, an ethical, aesthetic, political way of operating in the world, and in the interstices and bridges of other two coexisting modes of operating is and horror. It's also has been called a methodology, I would say a rebel one then, implicating both composition and improvisation. It also has its own vocabulary that can work as a traveling system of concept tools. And I will show you a cloud of some of those concept tools in a minute. So it can also be a research of the house of living together and ethics of care, or, and I'm using an expression of Martha Nussbaum, a gentle philosophy, which means, among other things, that it's not about authoritative pronouncements. So, there's one of the ways of investigating and of ways of investigation, modes of investigation and of transmission of modus operandi is through game apparatus that are both apparatus and counter apparatus, and we can talk about that in the Q&A part of this panel. So it's modus operandi resorts to this set of exercises that can also be probably thought of as a repertoire that function both as I was saying, as modes of transmission and modes of investigation. And these exercises are often designed as game apparatuses, and but they are supported by a specific ethics, a way of thinking, doing, feeling, also a specific regime, or if you don't want to use an authoritative word again, I will use Silvia Pinto Coelho's expression, gymnastics of attention, and that relates to one of the crucial concept tools of modus operandi, which is reparar, but I don't think I'll have time to go through that. So again, I'll be happy to talk about it later. But it is important to know that the end game is part of that ethics, and this procedure of using this premises of having a first position, a second position, and a third position is, but always with that ethics in mind of reparar. Reparar, it's a Portuguese word that doesn't translate, the English doesn't translate all of the modulations of reparar, but in the same word we have 3 modulations. I will say just that. So this noticing, or making in the vocabulary of and making an inventory, an inventory invention. And there's also the dilation, like stopping again, if you use hyphenation. And there's obviously the ethics of repair, of reparation, of caring. So this is always in our minds and in our bodies. I'm already contradicting myself using this distinction, but throughout the exercises. So this is so that you have this sense of how these games, although they might have a ludic aspect to it, they are because it's not incompatible, right? Being ludic and serious. And they are means of investigation. And the embodiment, which is one of the exercises that I will be focusing because of the use of photography in that exercise, continues to use this procedure of the basic game. So this is always there. And I have here, like, this is me playing the end game with a PowerPoint presentation, like a first position, which is the mirror, then the second position, which is creating a relation with the first, and then the third one, which is confirming a direction through a common plan, because it can be used, it can be played me with my multiples, or collectively, obviously, and then the common plan is sustained by that emergent rule. So each game has its own emergent rules. And I have here one example. Like, this is a first position, this is a second position, third position, and the unfolding of the game. So you can see, I think you can see that it's not whatever, like that people there's a response within an ethics of how to play the game. This is like a cloud of Anne's vocabulary, so that she can also have a sense of it. So we work with a collection of stuff, like discarded things that have been coming to Anne's collection for the past 10 years. And in this exercise of embodiment, of course, we use the stuff that are these things, and also the stuff that are these things, the bodies. I'm going to read an introduction made by Fernanda Eugenio of the game she sees in one of the workshops. This is an excerpt from the documentary that was made of the 10 years of the Anne Lab. So she says, so here at this exercise of embodiment, our research concerns the multiples. We've always been researching the multiples. When we play the basic game, we're already allowing them to appear. But in embodiment, we are inviting the multiples to appear so we can put on their forces and name them, so that we can invoke them at other times, and so that it becomes more and more explicit who we carry with us. So the journey involves following an initial process of ethnography and sensorial autoethnography, which consists of taking our attention to a corporeal dimension that is as incarnate and connected with the plan of sensation as possible, and allow for the manifestation of a force to emerge, a force which is being opened in the field of that body territory. This is part of the vocabulary. So the body that will become a figure, an embodiment of that force is called body territory. And the other players are called care curators, but of course these are modalities. They are not fixed roles. So when this force begins to manifest itself, we incarnate it and allow it to take shape, embodying it. This will make each person gain a kind of portrait, the portrait of a multiple. So a multiple can be with the person for a long time, or even almost all of that person's biographical time, or can just pass through visiting. What makes us able to make that force appear on a plan where it takes shape is the fact that the force summons dimensions of form that usually go together. So that force is extremely complex. So I'm going to show you how these are images of the exercise of the game being played. As you can see, everyone uses, I mean, cameras go through hands, and this is the name of struggle, which I'll tell you about it in a minute. So there's usually no credit to the photos, they just belong to the archive of EndLab. So the first time that people that might know the group La Pocha Nostra may find some resemblance. I can also talk about it later in the question and answer, because it was an influence in the first experiments, but then it became something other. There's a completely different semantics and ethics to it. So in this, what happens in the exercise is that there's one picture of that holds the force that is used then to transfer that force to a name of struggle. So I don't have pictures here because they are not very interesting of us making the inventory of those forces collectively, and then the person deciding on what that inventory is, using what appears in that collective inventory to come to the name of struggle. So what I want, let me see. Okay, so I have 5 minutes. Let's see. So there's this proposition that I make of End People as archive. So what I call End People are these users, like a moving constellation of human body archives that, by conjunctive concatenation, to use Berardi's expression, constitute this body of bodies, a body archive of body archives. It's a living and sentient, like Linda Caruso-Aviland says, archive constituted in and by multiplicity. So it's a multi-directional sentient corporeal archive that functions as a system or zone, and here I'm quoting Lepecki, where the work doesn't rest or stagnate, but is formed and transformed endlessly. Again, this was, so the body archive is a reenactor, what in a sense means, and again, following Lepecki, drawing on Benjamin, it is a translator, it is a restless, porous vessel and ungovernable, disobedient transmitter. And again, Lepecki, in its constitutive precariousness, perceptual blind spots, linguistic indeterminations, muscular tremors, memory lapses, bleedings, rages, and passions, the body as archive replaces and diverts notions of archive away from a documental deposit or a bureaucratic agency dedicated to the mismanagement of the past. An endless mobility emerges as constitutive of this particularly transformative, particularly performative archive without archive. So we can also think about this contradiction or paradox or oxymoron of the archive, of the body archive in this case. So modus operandi and further complicates dynamics between life and afterlife, and on one hand, how to circumscribe its life while it's living, and on the other hand, what to call its manifold proliferations, the multi-implication of body archives. It also complicates dynamics between bone and flesh, because, and quoting Schneider, how do we parse the duration of the life from the duration of the inanimate remains? And so modus operandi and starts, recurs, and persists through encounters for even, and I'm quoting Schneider again, document is given to remain for the life, for the future of its encounter again in time. So with all its inanimate or less animated materializations and lived and live iterations in instantiations, in its interanimation, Schneider, or interaction, Barad, modus operandi and is something inhabited that in turn inhabits one's corporeality. So we can also think about parasitism, or an assemblage of particles. So it lives in, within, it lives on. And now I'm going to really jump to I always take much longer than I think, to let you know why I brought these images. So, of course, this presentation is kind of stating the obvious, like this, even Amelia Jones spoke about the body archive. But what I feel about modus operandi is that this community is really a sustained community. And photography is used in many of the exercises and in manifold ways. So this use is intrinsic to many exercises like and body, but it's also used as for recording register, as you could see, different situations of transmission and of manifestation or materialization, workshops, performances, lectures, etc. So there's a vast archive of collection of still and moving images, but in this case of embodiments photographies, it can be said that it's a good anchor to further this discussion of performance or documentation being hailed by functioning as call, response, recall. So these images of the multiples are not one or the other, are a record and a document, and even perhaps a monument, a cenotaph of some sorts of this force that is not manifesting anymore. It's a performance, it's a hail. So it's a trigger as also, it suspends authorship also. And it gestures back and forward and sideways. So these images are this obvious manifestation of this overlapping, cohabiting, coexisting dimensions. And it can be, but this can be extended to other things. And here I'm also thinking about Latour when he speaks of things as gatherings. So to finish, kinship or interaction, again, Barad, of human bodies and more than human, and this more than human is from Denise Reis Silva, bodies in modus operandi and continuation without continuity, and here it's Adrian Ifil. This brings, I hope, another layer to Azalai's notion of the archive as shared body. So how this constitutes this archival entanglement. So there are two constellations at play in constant negotiation, hence archival entanglement. For, in one hand, this assemblage things and human bodies and more than human bodies. There's the assemblage of things, on one hand human bodies and on the other hand more than human bodies. And human bodies do not function or solely or don't function at all as interpreters or even manipulators of things. They are activators and reactivators in manifold ways, enactors and reenactors, body archives that incorporate, excorporate, and here transcorporate, which was Paulo Caspão that alert me to that, alongside other things. So I think I'll stop here because my time is up, right? Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Anna. We'll talk later. I'm sorry. You're welcome. I think this is Zoom, right? Ready? No. Doriane Mollet is going to present the theatrical body in everyday photography. Doriane is a contractual doctoral candidate at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. She is currently developing a thesis about amateur photographic albums from 1880 to 1980. While the practice of amateur photography has already been the subject of numerous analyses, the album as an object of self-fashioning was not yet studied. By proposing cross-reading of a broad range of disciplines, her research begins from the perspective of the subjects displayed to understand how the aesthetic usage of photography influenced the subject itself. She also queried the photographic medium through her practice at the École Nationale Supérieure des Beaux-Arts in Paris, from which she graduated in 2019. She has presented her research at the Collège des Bernardins in Paris, a colloquium Art Against the Machine, at Namur University in Belgium, a colloquium Chosen Portraits, subjective portraits, at the École Française de Rome seminar Nature and Fiction, and she also organized international colloquia at the Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art in Paris, namely Photography and Surveillance, at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, Aesthetics, Emotions and Wars, and at the University of Chicago in Paris, namely Construction and Deconstruction of Fighters' Identities Through Images. She is currently finishing an article for the essay Display and Concealment of the Human Body in the Public Space, to be published by the Presse Universitaire de Franche-Comté. You have the floor.
Thank you. And I would like to thank the organizers of this colloquium. I am sincerely happy to present in this context a part of the research I am currently carrying out in the framework of my thesis. Thesis which tries to understand how the aesthetic usages of photography and literature formed a new subjectivity. So it is a medium-sized album, thin, protected by a smooth camel-colored cover. It belongs to the collections of the Nicéphore-Niepce Museum in Chalon-sur-Saône. Its 16 pages are detached from its bidding, and the bidding is broken. A studio portrait of a young woman occupies half of the first page surface. She has a pale face, dark eyes, and curly hair. At the place of the subject identity for the collective imagination, the studio portrait looks like an opening scene of a play about love. It presents the young woman, André, to the viewer in a substitutive act characteristic of the indexical theory of photography. But can the portrait be a mark of its model, as footstep in the sand, in the words of Rosalind Krauss? And how does everyday photography redefine our relationship with reality and representation, document and fiction, memory and archive? The album studied here comprises 202 black and white photographs measuring 13 by 9 centimeters. André appears in 181 pictures. She is alone in 161 of them. The album exposed the nature of her daily life. Two of the protagonists, Robert, just here, the photographer and André's lover, and Didi, a friend of the couple, are also equally depicted in 17 pictures. Text often accompanies images. The framework is France during the 60s. The text splits the object into 28 sections with underlined titles. It also completes the photograph by proposing short novels or the protagonist's spoken words. The text deeply modified the apprehension of the photographic scenes. They form a whole. In addition, 12 poems by famous writers are inscribed on one page each. This album also contains 289 photographs in an envelope. They are many in black and white and sometimes in color. They are necessary for the understanding of this incomplete production. For example, while the album only mentions 2 first names on its pages, Didi and Tony, the independent photographs name our main protagonists, André and Robert. The texts are unwritten, but cannot guarantee the identity of the writing hand. We nevertheless learn that André is just 20 years old, and thanks to a search in the archives of French municipalities, I discovered that she was a professor of French literature. Robert is older than André by about 15 years. Finally, moving from city to city, the couple seems to belong to a relatively well-off social class. We can see it in the time spent reading, in the attention paid to clothing, hairstyles, makeup, in the nature of the annotations, and in the aestheticism of the photographs, which testify to the consciousness of the representational codes of fiction. It is with this archive commonly destined to the elaboration of a private memory that I propose to question the mise en scène of the image of the body, a woman's body, at the crossroads of the facts and the constitutive fiction of the self. I will attempt to demonstrate that the photographic portrait needs to be thought of as a staging of potentialities of being and not just as a slice of life. So we will see that photography is 1, a surface that covers more of us than our eyes can see. 2, a space for playing free from the exigencies of reality. And 3, an aesthetic form that affects the real and modulates the social. Photography does not only show, photography also acts via what it shows. In the collective imagination, photography creates predatory relationship between photographer and model, hunter and prey, man and woman. The word snapshot underlines the nature of this relationship, and the photographic magazine The Girl Watchers in the late 50s is a typical example of this culture. Photography will be witness to the domination of the female social body. Here, Robert dominates André by staging her. Robert's judgment of André generates an aesthetic photographic production that we can read as the looking glass self. Theorized by the American sociologist Charles Horton Cooley, the looking glass self consists of firstly, imagining the image that the other makes of me. Secondly, imagining the judgment that results from it. And finally, reacting to this judgment that I think is the one that the other makes of my image. According to Laura Mulvey, in a reading of Freudian theories in her article, Visual Pleasure Narrative Cinema, this predation climate of our patriarchal society structures all culture, and in particular cinema, in which the male viewer constructs a female form. Through its uses of time and space, the Gestalt design a Lebenswelt at the initiative of two distinct mechanisms, one scopophilia and two voyeurism. While the first, of a fetishist nature, exists outside narrative time as a neurotic gaze, the later, of a sadistic nature, involves a narrative linking pleasure to guilt. It is a mise en scène. For Mulvey, the male desire to scrutinize the feminine outlines imaginary, recognition, identification, and the formation of the I. In this album, the photographic staging makes the young woman a plural matter, proof of what she has been and theatrical fantasy that goes beyond her. Robert photographs André from all angles, from above and below, from the back, from the front, from near and far, but also naked in her underwear, as well as carefully dressed. She wears different hairstyles and makeup to take on any role in any film. These mise en scène base themselves on topoi of pictorial nudes. André is naked, but definitely bare, 12 times in the album and 26 times in the envelope. While the album avoids the theatricality of posing for a naturalistic storyline, the photograph in the envelope display it with excess. Lights and framing propose artificial results. We can have a look at this nude, similar to Auguste Renoir's painting Nu couché vu de dos. Let us also think of the work of Gustave Caillebotte, Amadeo Modigliani, or André Derain. The image of André on a stomach recalls the Odalisque Blonde, painted by François Boucher. The frame is only more frontal, the light cruder, the lace tighter. Finally, if the album rejects this aesthetic for naturalistic rendering, it is no less affected by it. Before pictures of André by Robert, the young woman asleep with the breast uncovered was the subject of many painters, as Natalie Chiavoni. To summarize, the fragmentation of André's body reveals scopophilia, breaking with the space of the Renaissance and the narrative depths. Poses and mise en scène serve the documentary aspect of the photographic process and fix a desirable body free of any narrative. In addition to the breast, Robert photographed the same way André's mouth, which smiles, opens, closes, and feeds. In the center of an image, we see a bottle of soda between her lips. Their hands have the same erotic treatment, also used in fashion photography of the same period by Blumenfeld, for example. André and Robert's album contain numerous erotic representations linked to the sociocultural mechanism depicted by Mulvey. Scopophilic forms crystallize an aesthetic idol from the historical differentiation of gender sustained by painting. We can read these images as narrative symbols enclosed in malobsessions at the origin of a Bildung. But through its elaboration, including editing, montage, and writing, the album will give less importance to the aesthetic emphasis of the envelope photographs in favor of a voyeuristic staging of a sadistic order. If in the envelope, the pictures of André and Didier only illustrate a tender friendship, the album shows rather erotic complicity. On the page entitled Duo, Didier is wearing a dress, André a nightgown with hair spread out in a mess. Does she like Didier? Didier, I love you is the answer. The next page shows André on a bed, a shirt pulled up to her hips. She laughs. Who's coming with me? Then Didier and Robert hold hands, Didier still in a flowery dress, Robert in underwear. Didier, I love you, he says. Then André and Didier are lying on the bed, the page entitled Lesbos. Gustave Courbet is not far from the shape suggested by the bodies. These pages sum up the enterprise of the entire album. Enclosed in a story, the images that isolate André's body become realities. It is no longer just a question of documentation. André and Robert's album projects what reality does to the social body, which it shapes through aesthetic to model it in conformity with the fantasized object. That is a strategy spearheaded by the absorption of the character that results in the negation of the viewer's gaze as proposed by Michael Fried. These amateur photographs not only serve as a tool for remembering, but also for heightening the present. Per the narration, the album constrains André by proposing representations that pre-exist her and by applying them to her. André performs as an actress who can be everything and nothing, joyful or sad, a container without content. As the Cocteau poem says, she is a mummy with golden mask. This amateur album is an imaginary space that molds reality under Robert's desires. The social body becomes a fixed aesthetic form for a private archive, and the photographic image leads to self-fashioning as defined by Stephen Greenblatt. However, we cannot simply think of an André dramatized by the lover's desires. Firstly, it is impossible to attribute the album construction just to Robert. In most notes, André emerges as the main narrator. In France, for a few years during the 60s, the Nouvelle Vague had been shaking up cinema and proposing new autonomous female characters that were as fascinating as threatening. And the couple couldn't have been unaware of such an art movement. As well, if the photography is indeed the young man, André sometimes takes the camera. This gesture offers ironic and symmetrical representations of Robert to the one he makes of her. Here, two images portray André, two others Robert, and they take turn reading in the same armchair, in the same room, near the same window, in the same postures. This theatrical mise en scène must be seen as the result of two subjects that enjoy it equally. The abusive use of adjectives also support the idea of co-construction. They are added to 26 snapshots and show André amused, irritated, sassy, a melancholic vamp, a little model girl, or a femme fatale. The model's face makes many mimicries, while the photographer multiplies the framing. A wide range of André's expressive abilities is displayed, like an actress portfolio with a succession of masks. André is deeply aware of the representation of a body as suggested by this emotion game, but also by the repeated presence of mirrors and the number of pictures that show her getting ready. The space offered by the album is that of a stage on which André exposes herself with a lover's complicity. From that perspective, we can say that photography takes part of her identity construction. She learns to move her body and exhibit it at the same time. Her portraits are enactments and not only reenactments, as Michel Poivert thinks in his landmark book on contemporary photography. Her portraits are enactments of reality while it is being experimented with. The complicity is shared, the seduction is mutual, and the look is a phenomenon of reciprocity which will lead to the legal officialization of an union, 2 snapshots of the young woman's hands indicated the marriage proposal. But André and Robert were never married. The album is a play that leads to an exhibition and exposes it. It induces self-fiction and proposes it to reality. The album also contains many direct speeches and stage directions. Between laughter and tenderness, the photographer's essays are those of lovers declining photograph of a loved one. If the photograph is not reality itself, neither is photography a theatrical word enclosed in reality. If the photograph is not just a natural and factual snapshot, neither is photography just a mise en scène. Like art in the visual anthropology of Alfred Gell, it is a system of action whose scope modifies and intensifies the social as society shapes it. The photographic image is a modeling clay with a mimetic power. Addressing and undressing, makeup and self-reflection in a mirror. In Cannes, André poses in front of a large mirror, exposing the body and the process of reflexivity proposed by the medium. She is standing in her underwear and laughs at seeing herself as beautiful. Yet she's not looking at herself. A reflection gazes at the operator. Next, she holds a hand mirror. Behind a curtain unfolds. The mirror circumscribes André's face. The aesthetic result is that her head is a floating body supported by a reflexive surface supported itself by a sculpted piece that reproduces the shape of a hand, just here. The curtains could belong to a small theater. André may not be used to looking in the mirror very often, but she plays with this image aware of her own posing body and attentive to the gaze placed on the body by her lover. Photography allows us to exist in many ways because each photograph is the fabrication of the present experimentation. This alternative space shows how much this daily practice of photography interfaces with self-apprehension. This is where they see themselves in emotional reciprocity, the camera as an erotic mediator. And by doing so, they partly build their love. In this way, the question of clothing is also fascinating. André lies in her underwear on numerous occasions. On one page shows 3 pictures without text. André is standing in front of a light wall. She takes off her trousers, under which a pair of white panties appear. Then she is wearing black panties and a pale garter. A 4th image appears to be part of the series, but has not been included. André wears a blouse, pencil skirt, and pumps. The ritual displayed is silent. No caption directs the reading. Only the diagonal movement of the page's composition suggests an interpretation. The street clothes are left behind for private adornment, the nudity interfaced. The actress wears a costume and presents the audience with the secret of a transformation. Other narrative form redouble André's involvement, and firstly, the recurring motif of the woman at the window. Between private and public spaces, intimacy and representation. These photographs tend to reveal André at the border of 2 spaces, both protected and exhibited. And 30 snapshots in the album and 14 in the envelope show in such configuration, playing with lights, shadows, and curtains that surround the window. In the same vein, 2 scenes make André the partner of the story, waiting and the art of using a bed. In the 2nd episode, there are 4 photographs of André lying down. The room is a stage to be organized according to the moment. André can be a child, as well as a mother, wife, and mistress. The bed is the prop form which unfolds. In waiting, the window rises as a central character, and the text leads the gaze. First turn outwards, André waits for a man. He won't come, he may come, he will come, and then he has come, written on the photograph of a sofa with a teddy bear on it. The teddy bear takes the place of the longed-for man, Robert perhaps. But the teddy bear is already visible in the first image. The man was maybe already there. So what's the expectation? It seems to be a game whose aim is to sublimate the unity of the couple. Furthermore, the negatives are developed as they travel, just like the reading that accompany them daily. Each city is more than a place of passage. For André and Robert, photography is the place where at the same time, it is possible to play with oneself and the place where it is possible to contemplate this play. In this way, photography brings subjectivity and objectivity together and instigates a dialogue between both to elaborate a compromise at the root of the self, a woman fantasized and a woman who fantasizes herself. The photographic playground allows the elaboration of a creative compromise between the constraints imposed by reality and one's own needs. Through the visual observation it engages, it organizes a new space for emancipation, a performance of being a social body. To conclude, the boundaries between representation and reality are blurred. This is even more true where the picture concerns intimacy and feeds on desires, fantasies, and unspoken feelings in our private archives. Emotional parody stands at the heart of the image and text produced by André and Robert. Document, mise en scène, what is the nature of what the couple shows of André? Neither document nor fiction, the portraits are both. They show how much this medium installs as a part of the institution of our individuation. Moving away from the dichotomy of reality fiction and further document theatricality allows us to consider the photographic as an agent by relying on aesthetic logic. As such, photography is inherent to social relationships. Indeed, it extends reality through the image and knowledge of ordinary life. It does not only serve to understand the sociocultural norms in which one involves. It mediates and infers new value, new impressions, and new actions. It builds and modifies. It imprints reality and offers new identifying modalities by permitting to be at the same time anyone and everyone, by providing a form as truthful, theatrical, and natural. Photography allows self-reflection, self-knowledge, and self-fashioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorian. So now the hard task, I'll try to make some kind of wrap up, which is something that I don't really like very much. Okay. Yes.
Thank you for the presentations. It was really interesting. And to me, there was something that appeared in the presentations that I'm also trying to figure out. But do you think there's a difference between the digital medium and the analog medium for photography? Because I think, Anna, you mentioned that your photographs are analog, that you are using certain techniques that are more risky, more subject to accidents, but also harder to edit or Photoshop. Maybe, I don't know. Do you think it's a different commitment to perform for analog film or not? And I think it's in the family album, there was also this question of, the selection. There were pretty good photos, so maybe there was some technical. I don't know if it plays a part in your reflection about the construction of these identities and subjectivities. Thank you.
Well, it's for me, it's very different, obviously, working with film and digital. And if I could work only with film, I would, but it's become too expensive to do so. And the reason I mention that is because in that series 11, doing that actual project just on film was technically challenging. I could have done it digitally and just do a montage, but what really interested me was the imperfections, and you would never have the same feel with digital. So for me, that specific project, which became quite expensive because I did spend a lot of rolls of film. But yeah, I think it's quite different.
I would say the same, and my thesis stopped with the beginning of the digital, because I think it's really complicated to work on family photo album during the digital. So yeah, I think it's different.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Well, thank you first of all for 3 beautiful presentations. I would like to address maybe a very particular question to Ana Janeiro, because some of the works that you have presented, they reminded me of a notion that Tina Kempt, the feminist sociologist, has worked on about pose and stasis. And although I know she works on this notion in a very different context from 19th century anthropology, photography, so completely different context, she addresses this idea of pose and stasis and muscular tension somehow. So there was something very bodily and physical in some of your works too. And what I like a lot in her consideration of this notion of stasis is that she says that this stasis she finds in these photographs is neither an absence of movement or neither a cessation of movement, is rather like two conflicting movements that momentarily come together in an apparent equilibrium, but is something very tense in a way. I'm kind of extrapolating a lot, I know, in terms of context, but still there was something in your work about the detail of the pose, in some of your projects at least, that you go into the very detailed pose that you try to replicate or embody again, or these kind of things. And I was wondering whether you also think about this idea of impersonating a posed gesture as a sort of a conflicting movement somehow, because there is something also very normative or regulatory about the gestures and the pose that women assume before the camera. So what I like about Tina Kempt's notion is that she talks not only about like compelled or compulsory poses, but also involuntary practices. And I don't know, there was something resonating in your work. And a much briefer question also to Doriane later.
Can I just answer this one first, because then I'll
Sure,
forget
sure.
everything? Because it's quite a long question.
No, just the pose plays a role.
But no, but there's a lot of interesting things in it. It does resonate a lot with what I do. I mean, most of my projects, yes, they're constructed. The whole scene, especially the one about the children's tales, it was written like a film with a storyboard, checking out locations, wardrobe. So it does work a bit like that. And yes, definitely the body, there is tension in the body, and not just tension. There's a complete control of all the muscles, obviously, because you, as I was mentioning about the pose, is you create the image before it is actually shot in the camera. So you're thinking about every little detail and how that's going to, so the camera is not just there, it's also here. And also about gesture, the last project that I showed, not my self-portraits, but the last project, The Archive is Present, was really developed about how gesture and the gestures and poses found in my grandmothers in the family albums, how they were actually telling a story of the politics that existed during the dictatorship in Portugal over women's bodies. And it was actually physically difficult for me to mimic and to embody some of the poses on my grandmother, on my father's side, because they were so different from my own codes and poses and the things that I socially grew up with. So that for me, having to physically be in someone else's body or act or gesture in the same ways was very difficult, but also taught me, and I learned a lot about the actual, the meanings behind that conditioning of gesture and of body and of pose and how one should act. So it was very, very, very interesting. Thank you.
For Dorian, just a very practical thing that came to my mind. Whether you, while looking at this album, have you considered the influence, because we're talking about the 60s, right?
Yeah.
The influence of the medium of the photo novel or the film photo novel, actually, because some of these ideas also within the couple and the building up a fantasy is something that crosses this medium too. Something that came to me.
Yeah, it question that remains a lot. Yes, of course, but now it's the beginning of my thesis, and I try to understand the relationship between photos and theater and literature, and after to see other medium like cinema, but also roman photo to understand that. So yeah, I know, but I don't have a lot of lecture about that.
The other one. I thank you, Annie, for your presentation, and I'm very curious to know how that relation. Sorry, I'm very curious to hear a little bit more about that relation to the specific images and how that mimicking or embodiment comes to existence. Like I do how the duration of that process. Is it just in connection? I mean, can it ever be just in connection to those specific images, or does it carry a whole story and of your own relationship to your grandmothers, and so how all does I mean, probably it's very difficult to answer, but if you have any more to say about that, I'm very curious.
Yeah, so in specific case of that project, the archive is present. It really was about analyzing the photographs of my two grandmothers and trying to decode a bit what those poses could have meant, how they were posing. Things like, the way a woman sits crossing her legs and that she puts her hands on, and all those little details, and really looking into that. Then the process of embodiment was started with mimicking, of trying to put myself in those poses. And then there was a process of deconstruction. So then it starts being a process of embodiment. So I take those poses onto myself. They're with me now. I can't get rid of them. So, but I think for the rest of my projects and my work, And mentioning a bit what Rebecca Schneider mentioned in the first day, our gestures and our poses aren't just our own, right? They're things we inherit from what we learn from our families, from our friends, from society in general. So there's layers and layers of what that makes your gesture or transforms your gesture into. Of course, when you're using your own body, or in my case, when I'm using my own body, photographing, or in the case of my self-portraits, for example, the body is speaking as well. It's not just the face, right? So everything has, sometimes it can be more or less conscious, but there's always, your body is also saying something, even if you don't know what it is. And I think that's one of the reasons why the camera is there, so that you can kind of decode a bit more what those poses and gestures mean. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, everyone here and around. We have to end. I just wanted to say well, a few things just to that stayed throughout your presentations and resonations, and also some resonation to the performance before. And that's what makes me, now I would go somewhere for a week with all your work, with all my questions, and to ask exactly about those specific practices of incorporation, or also how this going through this over-determined visual archive, which is most of it, for the most part, patriarchal, and how you reenacted, not only reenacted, but enacted. And that's an interesting differentiation also, that also meets your question about where, which is a rhetoric question, I think, about whether there is a border between fiction and reality, and where it is, of course, and which is resonates with yours about the border between representation and reality, or the non-border, that is the contamination, and that's where the feel changes everything. And it also resonates a lot about the kind of archive, how was it, the end archive, the body of bodies, which was would require more time really to pinpoint the specific, because it's more uncommon as a kind of archival practice. And I got very curious. So I would love to know more. I will try to know more about all the work you presented, and I wanted to thank. And we go home now.